So, Danny, it's great to see you, and thanks so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me here. I love talking about this subject, so I really look forward to the next few minutes.
As someone who has been part of the global counter-illicit finance mission since its inception, and who's had leadership roles at the Treasury Department and at the Financial Action Task Force well before and well after 9/11, we'd love to hear your perspective on the evolution of the mission. So, what was the field like in the 1980s and 90s? Who were the key players, and what were the issues of the day?
It's a great question, because one of the cool things I think about this whole field, the field of illicit finance, AML, CFT, is how relatively new the whole thing is. The first country to criminalize money laundering anywhere in the world was the United States, and that was in 1986. Which I guess is starting to get a long time ago, but for me it feels like it was just yesterday. And when the U.S. criminalized it in 1986, it was just for the proceeds of narcotics trafficking. And so everything we're doing today, everything we're talking about today, really started at that moment when the United States criminalized the laundering of the proceeds of narcotics trafficking. The world quickly caught up with the United States, and in 1988, in the Vienna Narcotics Convention, you see the first international obligation to criminalize money laundering, again, just in the context of narcotics trafficking. And so you have the whole world sort of moving in this direction in the late 80s, and nobody really knew what the implications of all this was. There was a lot of differences in the way people were enforcing it, and the way people were thinking about it, and the way different countries were applying it in their financial systems. And the G7 got together in 1989 and tried to bring some order to this, tried to establish a body that would create international standards that everybody could look to. And that was the origins of the Financial Action Task Force. So in 1989, right in the beginning of the 90s, the Financial Action Task Force was formed by the G7. It was quickly, by the mid-90s, expanded to 26 or so countries at the time, most of the international financial centers. And it really launched two important projects. One was to establish the FATF 40 recommendations, which set the international standards for anti-money laundering. And it was just anti-money laundering time. Nobody was talking about terrorist financing yet. And those standards were in criminal law, regulatory law, and international cooperation. And there was a very conscious decision that was made to do this as FATF quote-unquote recommendations, as international standards, and not through a treaty process, as a matter of international law. And that was so that FATF could be forward-leaning in what it was putting into place. International negotiations regarding treaties tend to be lowest common denominator because countries need to have an international obligation to conform to those treaties. Whereas the fact that this was international standards allowed FATF to be a little forward-leaning. Now, so many years later, the FATF standards really virtually do have the force of international law, sometimes even more powerful than international law because of the role they play in the international financial system. And then the second thing that FATF did was launch a mutual evaluation process to ensure that all of its members were working towards implementing the FATF standards. And that's really how the whole thing started. And then through the evolution of the FATF standards, you had a widening of the sets of obligations. The definition of money laundering was expanded to include all serious crimes, not just drug trafficking. The regulatory obligations expanded as countries started to do more and more and cover more and more sectors. And then finally, you get to 9/11, and the standards are increased to include terrorist financing. So that's that's your first, say, 15 years of the FATF. The one other thing I should add to that is the introduction of what at the time was known as the NCCT process, the non-cooperative countries and territories process. So by the time you get to the late 90s, it's pretty obvious that even though the FATF members, to a greater or lesser extent, are all working towards implementing international standards, there are plenty of countries out there who were not. And FATF took what at the time was a quite risky move, but ultimately backed up by the economic might of the G7 to start publishing lists of countries that were non-cooperative. The first list came out in 1999 and included a lot of smaller countries and places that you'd expect, like the Caribbean and the Pacific, but it also included some fairly significant countries as well. The first couple of FATF lists included countries like Israel, like Philippines, like Hungary. Some of the most important countries. Russia wound up on the list. So FATF really was sending a message that it was willing to take on anybody. That process evolved over time, and I'm happy to talk about it if you're interested into the ICRG process, the blacklisting and graylisting process that we have today.
So how has the use of sanctions changed over time? When have they been most effective, and why?
So sanctions have been used as a form of economic warfare from time immemorial. Thucydides talks about the use of boycotts and blockades by the Athenians. So it's been with us for a long time, and it's taken on various forms. The first time sanctions were really examined in a serious way with an eye towards the strategic application of the tool as part of a broader effort was interestingly by various European academics in the 1990s, with an eye with the notion that sanctions, as they had been applied earlier, were quite broad. Trade sanctions against entire countries, and the idea was that a lot of innocent people were being hurt by the application. Now, I'll tell you that there's a lot of truth to that. I'll also say that those types of sanctions can be quite effective. If we just look at the global boycott against South Africa, primarily it was what was one of the main things that brought an end to the apartheid regime. So I don't think jurisdictional sanctions should be completely ruled out, but there was this notion that we could be more strategic, that we could be more targeted. And what evolved from all of this was the notion of targeted conduct-based sanctions. And you saw that really come into its own post 9/11. They were being used before then. But where they really became an important part of the U.S. toolbox and the global toolbox was after 9/11 with sanctions relating to terrorist financing. From then on, you saw virtually every international security crisis or virtually every major U.S. foreign policy initiative involve some form of conduct-based targeted financial sanctions. I do think that conduct-based targeted financial sanctions are quite important, but I do think that they're only one tool what really should be an arsenal that countries have, and particularly that the United States has, to include jurisdictional sanctions, to include conduct-based targeted measures. There's various ways you can combine those two, and then other forms of financial pressure and financial coercion as well. And these have all been used in the context not just of terrorist financing, but in the context of nuclear arms proliferation, in the context of North Korea, Iran, Russia, Venezuela. Sanctions have become one of the favorite tools, particularly of the United States, because of the unique role it plays as custodian of the U.S. dollar.
So everyone has heard about sanctions, but fewer people are familiar with the so-called 311 actions, the USA Patriot Act. Can you explain what 311 actions are and why they matter? Maybe by using the case of Banco Delta Asia as an example. I understand you played a key role in that action.
I'm happy to. I could talk about Banco Delta Asia for quite some time. Unfortunately, we don't have 3 or 4 hours to discuss this, but I'll do my best. One of the other tools of financial coercion or financial pressure that the United States has is an authority found in Section 311 of the USA Patriot Act, which is why it's generally known as Section 311. Now, to be honest with you, the idea of Section 311 was bouncing around at the U.S. Treasury Department in the late 90s, early 2000s, even before the Patriot Act. But that's where the Patriot Act is when it was enacted, and what it gives the Secretary of the Treasury the authority to do is to identify a foreign person, a foreign jurisdiction, a foreign financial institution, or a class of transactions as being of primary money laundering concern to the United States. And once the Secretary so designates that threat as a primary money laundering concern, he is then authorized to regulate the U.S. financial system to protect themselves from that threat. Everything from enhanced reporting requirements all the way up to requiring the threat to be cut off from the U.S. financial system. All U.S. financial institutions required to cut off connectivity with that designated entity. Section 311 was very unique in many ways. It was a sort of a combination of protective measures, defensive measures that the U.S. could take to protect its financial system from abuse, but to being able to project those defensive measures sometimes in a very aggressive sort of way. And Banco Delta Asia is certainly one example of that. It wasn't the first use of Section 311, but it was a very early use of Section 311. Banco Delta Asia is a bank in Macau. It was a very, very small bank, but was a bank that was very much connected with North Korea's regime and conducting financial transactions, illicit financial transactions for the North Koreans. Was also a hub for North Korean counterfeit currency, counterfeit U.S. dollars called supernotes. And the Treasury Department designated Banco Delta Asia in September of 2005. In September of 2005, yes, they designated Banco Delta Asia. What followed was extraordinary, because not only did Banco Delta Asia become disabled to the point where the Macau Monetary Authority needed to put it into receivership, but the entire international financial system reacted by, within just a couple months, completely cutting North Korea off from the international financial system. I was a huge 311 advocate and champion, and even I was surprised by how quickly the international financial system responded and how broadly the international financial system responded. The use of Section 311 really was a proof of concept for us within the U.S. government and for us within the U.S. Treasury Department, who were still sort of trying to figure out where the Treasury Department fit into broader U.S. national security, the broader national security framework. Once we all saw what we were capable of doing at the Treasury Department in terms of cutting a jurisdiction off from the international financial system quite quickly, albeit a country like North Korea, which is already quite isolated, we started to think, can we do this in other contexts? And that leads you directly to the financial campaign against Iran.
Can you talk a bit about what the UAE has focused on and done to improve their counter-illicit finance regime? You were intimately involved in getting them off the FATF gray list. So what have they done?
The important thing to understand when thinking about the UAE and really any country, most countries that find themselves on FATF's gray list, is that a few years ago, FATF altered its approach to how it assessed countries. Prior to, I don't know the exact date, prior to this round of evaluations, FATF would primarily look at the laws and regulations of a jurisdiction. Yes, FATF said that it also looked at implementation, but it was a very superficial examination of implementation, and it was really much more focused on the technical compliance. We're getting to a point globally, where just about everybody can at least have certain laws and regulations on their books. Not everybody, but by this point, if a country doesn't have the right or most of the right laws and regulations, it's really lagging behind. So what FATF shifted to is, for the first time, and it was quite innovative, assessing countries not just for technical compliance, but for effective implementation. Most of the countries that find themselves on the gray list are on the gray list because they've scored poorly in effective implementation, and this was the case with the UAE. The UAE had virtually all the laws and regulations on the books, but they scored poorly on effective implementation. I feel very strongly that the most senior levels of the UAE government understood that this was a problem, that the UAE needed to pick up its game in this regard, and they fully empowered the AML-CFT authorities to take steps necessary to get off of the gray list, and we were very happy and very honored to be able to work with them on this. The UAE assembled an international interagency committee, the Executive Office for Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorist Financing, and this new agency marshaled all the efforts of the UAE to implement agency by agency action plans and to implement a UAE global action plan, again, in criminal law, in regulatory law, and in international outreach. And no expense was spared. And they really had quite a bit of success. And it's very important because the UAE, and Dubai in particular, is an international financial center. And it's important as an international financial center to be not just playing by the anti-money laundering rules, but to be actually leading the world in this. And that's what the UAE set out as their objective. They've made tremendous progress working with us. They have come off the FATF gray list, but the UAE is not going to stop there. The UAE is going to establish itself as a global leader in anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing, as they want to be and as they should be, given the role they play in the world.
So, turning a bit to the personal, you've probably traveled to more places and had more meetings with more counter-illicit finance stakeholders than anyone else in the world, or at least you're in the top 10 list. So, can you share a story that stands out in your mind as particularly noteworthy?
A good story, or one that makes me look good anyway, is I am one of the few people who has actually delivered an anti-Hezbollah speech in Beirut. I was in Beirut to talk to the Lebanese bankers about Hezbollah, and Hezbollah clearly knew I was there because they were putting up their propaganda, like sort of along the routes that I was driving. So I went to the Lebanese Bankers Association. And I gave a speech where I called upon Lebanon to resist Hezbollah, and then raced off to the airport. And we released the speech as I was wheels up. But the point of that is not to say how brave or daring I am, but really to focus on. If you believe in this stuff and you want to work on this stuff, you want to work on it in places where it really matters. So I always want to be where it really matters, where the rubber meets the road. Certainly when it comes to counter-terrorist financing, one of the many places the rubber meets the road is in Lebanon. But there are other places too. And you've got to go out there, you got to show your face. And you got to let them know that, we have a big stick with the international financial system, and it is a weapon that we're prepared to use.
And finally, there are many who are watching this who are relatively new to the mission, who are early on in their careers, and who work on the front lines of transaction monitoring and sanctions screening. So what advice can you share with them about the importance of the mission and about the impact they can have now and throughout their careers?
Well, I think the impact they can have now is obvious. As you say, they're on the front lines of the effort to protect the international financial system from abuse, and to undermine the financial networks that support rogue regimes that support terrorist organizations, that support narcotics trafficking organizations, organized crime. They are part of that fight, and they are as important as any other part of that fight. As far as their careers go, if you're working on these issues now at a frontline level, you're gaining so much experience and knowledge that you're going to be able to apply for the rest of your career. I guess my advice is, take chances. When I started my career at the U.S. Treasury Department, the job that I finally wound up with many years later, Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing, didn't even exist. It didn't exist when my career started. So I could never have planned out my career. I was fortunate to be in the right place at the right time, on a couple of different occasions. But in another way, you make your own luck. Things are going to come your way, and just be ready to take advantage of them when they do.